Grace and peace. Today I just want to do a quick video on Luke 21:24, which is often used to support the assertion that no authentic Israelite could be in the land of Jerusalem today. The verse says, "And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Now I think it's important to understand the context of this verse. And this context ties back to verse number 6, where Jesus is obviously referring to the temple. Jesus says, "As for these things that you see, days will come in which not one stone will be left on another stone that will not be thrown down." So Jesus here is obviously referring to the temple. My opinion is that the context is lost because when the disciples asked Jesus, what will be the sign? When will these things happen? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? Jesus goes into the events surrounding his second coming. And so oftentimes the context is lost because if you read those things, Jesus gets into a brief homily about his second coming before he gets back into verse number 12, where he begins to address the events specific to the destruction of the temple. Verse 12 says, "But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you." So this means that verses 12 through 24 are chronologically prior to verses 7 through 11. Verses 7 through 11 would be referring specifically to the second coming. Verses 12 through 24 are referring to the destruction of the temple and would tie back into verse 6. This is key because many people would point out that, well, the second coming obviously has not occurred. Therefore, this verse still remains to be fulfilled. But I think if we have that understanding that Jesus is kind of blending his second coming and the destruction of the temple, he's speaking about two separate things in this passage, then obviously verses 12 through 24 are specifically about the destruction of the temple. And you can see this because when you get into the context leading up to verse number 24, it says, "But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those inside it must depart, and those in the fields must not enter it, because these are the days of vengeance, so that all the things that are written can be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing their babies in those days, for there will be great distress on the earth and wrath against his people." So all of these things support the idea that this is about a conquering of Jerusalem, a military defeat, a military takeover of Jerusalem. And we can see this when we define this word trampled down, or some translations would say downtrodden. And I think it's important to know why we use things like the BDAG. The BDAG is a lexicon, and what lexicons do is they define words in context. Because when you use something like the Strongs would just give you a list of possible definitions. But all words have a semantic range. All words have multiple different definitions that you could use or that they could mean. But when we use words in context, they have one meaning that's intended. The author has one meaning in mind. And for me, it's important to rely on scholars, people who know the language, to define those words. And so this word is defined as the undisciplined swarming of a victorious army through a conquered city. When we define that word in context, and I think, again, when we look at verse 20, verse 21, 22, and 23, and we see all of this is referring to the conquering, the surrounding by armies, woe to those who are pregnant in those times, it becomes clear that this definition of the word pateo, the undisciplined swarming of a victorious army through a conquered city, is implied. And because that word is implied, we can look to the land of Jerusalem today, and we don't see the undisciplined swarming of a victorious army through a conquered city, right? And I think that's important to know. So lastly, what I would say is that this passage, the context is about the destruction of the temple, right? If we can connect verses 12 to 24 to verse number 6, the phrase times of the Gentiles is used nowhere else in Scripture. Now, I will admit that there are plenty of Christian scholars, plenty of theological traditions that have their opinion on what exactly the times of the Gentile means. When did they start? Many people connect it back to Daniel and to Babylon and things like that, and when Israel lost its kingship and things of that nature. But I think it's important because this word is only used once. Let's define it in context, in the context in which it's used. And in the context in which it's used, the times of the Gentiles refers to the destruction that will come upon Jerusalem. And then lastly, I would say there are those who may try to connect times of the Gentiles with fullness of the Gentiles in Romans 11:25. But in my opinion, that may be a bit presumptuous because in Luke, what's being referred to is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Gentiles. And in Romans 11, what's being referred to is the salvation of the Gentiles. So I think there's two completely different contexts there, and a connection being made between those two pericopes is not really certain. And I don't think we should do things like that because you can come to false conclusions and make false connections. I think it's important to define these words in context. So with that being said, just wanted to share my brief thoughts on this passage. And hopefully I provided some resources. Hopefully I provided some information. And feel free to comment. Feel free to like, subscribe. And if you have an objection, leave your objection, and I'll take it into consideration. Until next time, God bless.